Welcome. In the past, if you wanted to learn about spirituality, you studied with who was right there, like who was in your village, who was in your town. It might be your priest, your rabbi, your inman, your local meditation guy, your local um, martial arts teacher. That's what was available and that's what you studied. Like for me, I didn't know there were any other techniques other than transcendental meditation when I was 15. As far as I knew, for a really long period of time, I didn't know there was any other technique. I would just say I meditate, and I assumed that there wasn't any other technique other than mantra meditation. It served me well. And over time, of course, I found, oh my gosh, there are a lot of other techniques and a lot of traditions. I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of practice. This is pretty autobiographical, and this is part 3. In the past, I've talked a little bit about how my practice has moved from kind of an innocently falling into a tradition to moving into willful practices, to moving into all kinds of other techniques and so forth. I learned transcendental meditation when I was 15, and it just blew my mind. I did that very intensively for about 15 years. And again, it served me beautifully. I wasn't really interested in any other techniques. I just interested in going deeper with the one that I had found. I then stumbled into an ashram, and I practiced in the context of kind of classical yoga. The whole idea of Raja Yoga, of moving from the valley floor to the top of the mountain. So focus on ethical behavior, focus on purifying the deep-seated tensions in the body, all kinds of different breathing techniques, absorption techniques, using concentration, flow, resting in presence. Very, very willful form of practice, and a very willful time in my life of having a poverty vow, a celibacy vow, working 6.5 days a week, really striving. Now, there was a lot of great stuff about that. It was also, as I like to describe it, chasing lights and rainbows. I was definitely gunning for altered states. That all shifted for me when I had my first experience of a retreat where we focused on doing nothing. And suddenly there was this realization that relaxation and letting go is this incredible practice. So where I'd like to pick this up is over the years, my couple decades of living in the ashram, we went through a crisis. And I'm not going to belabor the whole story, even though it's sordid and kind of entertaining. I think I was one of the, like a senior teacher at that time, leading retreats. And I was leading lots of meditation retreats and all that sort of thing in the ashram. And I was on a kind of a family reunion. I got a call from someone on the board saying something really wretched has happened. And we'd like you to come back and do the PR and, the public relations through this. And this incredible organization, which had been built up over many, many years, at that time seemed pretty stable. I had done a bunch of work with the press and so forth. And I remember at that time I was contacted by someone from an NBC news show who's doing an expose on transcendental meditation, of all things, my original form of practice for 15 years. And they were looking for something as a counterbalance. It seemed really squeaky clean. And they said, your organization, from all of what our researchers tell us, is you're squeaky clean. At that time, a lot of the ashrams were crumbling. Most of the major ashrams in the West by that time had something had fallen apart. I had mentioned in a previous talk how lineage traditions can be really, really powerful, because what lineage traditions do is you have this sense of quality control. You have a sense of your teacher has been vetted. What happens, though, is when you have a lineage tradition and it focuses on the teacher, it's kind of infantilizing. It becomes all about the teacher, and that's kind of what was happening in our community. And as it turns out, that there are some breaches of trust, some primary breaches of trust, and our teacher was asked to leave the ashram, which is a horrifically intensive practice where everything fell apart. Donors wanted their money back. So I helped to kind of manage the public relations through that. And it became an exploration of the melting down of the ashram and trying to create a new ecumenical non-sectarian center. And I spent the next 7 years trying to rebuild Kripalu Center in that fashion. Eventually, I ended up leaving after 24 years. I met my wonderful wife, Tara, I was actually at a conference. I was president of Kripalu at that time, part of this transition. And we were doing a conference called East Meets East, Yoga and Buddhism. And there was like the Buddha team and then the yoga team. And I was on the yoga team. And at any rate, it was it was a great conference, but I met Tara and like lights kind of flipped on for both of us. And I kind of explored moving down to Washington, D.C. My time had kind of come to a close as president. And when you're at head of an organization, there's nowhere to go but leave. And of course, Tara was very deep into the tradition of insight meditation or Vipassana. Now, earlier, because I was leading lots of meditation retreats, many, many retreats over the years, I was asked if I wanted to go and do a retreat with S.N. Goenka. If you're not familiar with S.N. Goenka, he brought forward a very powerful, very orthodox form of practice, and it's quite popular in the United States. It is a kind of a no-holds-barred, direct, very powerful, very challenging retreat. It's 10 days, 10 hours a day, no reading, no writing, no talking, no exercise, just deeply giving yourself to the practice. You start off the retreat by taking vows, so you really are taking the monk's vows. So you're living as a monk for those 10 days. And the first 4 days of the practice are practicing what's called anapanasati, which is awareness of the breath. And you start with a general sense of the breath at the nostrils, and then the next day you narrow it, and you narrow it to where you're just feeling the breath outside the body, just on the upper lip. And then on the 4th day, you're initiated into a sweeping technique, which is it's a body scan technique. So you're just scanning through the body. I came from the yoga tradition, where if you feel something, you move it. You feel the energy, you let it flow. In this retreat, we sat 10 hours a day for 10 days. The antithesis of feel the energy and let it flow. We sat in grids, and there was someone in front of me who sat ramrod. He took a little white towel, rolled it up, he sat on the towel ramrod straight. At the end of the day, when there was a talk from Goenka, you were invited to relax a little bit. Not this guy. He sat there ramrod straight. He kind of had very short hair, very kind of a fit, muscular guy. And I hated this dude. I just hated him because my body was on fire with pain. I could not sit still. One of the other nice things about the retreat was you could change your seat around to make it work for you. And I started off with, inspired by him, of one small little pillow. And by the end of the 10 days, I had built a lazy boy recliner out of cushions. Staring at the back of his head, I was clear I had a very good read on this guy. And while, of course, you're not looking at people you're not reading. I was, kind of aware of him. And I was convinced, I had a whole story in my mind that he was a gay art dealer from Boston. Later, after we chatted, wonderful guy, he was a firefighter from Duluth, Minnesota, which completely blew my sense of personal intuition. And he would actually work long days as a firefighter. And then when he would open up space, he would come and do these retreats. Amazing practitioner. What I found over the course of those 10 days, which was probably the most challenging 10 days of my life, were some very, very deep insights. One was the clarity of teaching through the Buddhist lens. Extraordinary. I came from a deeply immersed in the yoga tradition, which certainly has its own incredible, powerful elements to it. There's a willful element, but the form of yoga that we did was about moving and releasing and surrendering to energy flow. And this was around really taking that sense of the observer and sitting through the discomfort. Really transformative. So when I met Tara and I moved to Washington, D.C., I started to find my way to teaching through this lens of Buddhist practice. And more than that, I began to deepen my practice in Vipassana. At that time, Tara taught a lot with Jack Kornfield, and she was talking about me and what I might do. And I remember her asking him, well, like, what can he do to deepen his practice? And Jack said, well, he just needs to do some longer retreats. And I remember when I heard that, I was a little offended. I thought, I've been practicing all these years. I lead retreats. Why would I need to practice a retreat, actually do a retreat? And then I did my first month-long retreat, 30 days in silence, doing classical retreat practices at Spirit Rock Retreat Center. And I came to such a deep understanding of the power and the impact of these practices. I had no idea. And I have to say, if you want to deepen your practice, there is nothing more powerful than engaging into some time for intensive practice. It is the best investment of time and fortune that I can think of. At the end of that month-long retreat, I was ready to sign up for the next month if I could have. I've subsequently done other month-long retreats, and I find them to be tremendously powerful. It's one thing to have a conceptual understanding of the practices. It's another to immerse yourself into the blender of engaging in the practices. There's something referred to as verified faith in this tradition. That is, you hear a teaching, and there's sort of the sense of like, well, let me just assume that's true. And that's kind of like magical thinking. If I just think it, then it's going to be true. Verified faith or mature faith is where you take a concept on and then you work it. One of the things I most find empowering for me is when the Buddha allegedly said, do not believe a word of what I'm telling you. You have to verify this for yourself. I love that about this particular tradition. This is not about blind faith. This is about verified faith from deep inside yourself. So, for example, if you hear a teaching like anything born out of causes and conditions is subject to change, don't take it at face value. Check it out. Is it true that anything born out of causes and conditions is subject to change? It's only after rigorous investigation that you can determine for yourself whether that is true or not. And when you have verified that for yourself, you're practicing at a completely different level. So I've had some very, very powerful years of exploring through this lens of Vipassana, through insight meditation. And I've also been drawn to other practices, and I'd like to touch on those a little bit as well. The practices, the traditions that come from the non-dual, through the practice of Dzogchen, through the teachings of Sri Nisargadatta, of Adyashanti, Rupert Spira. There are other elements of practice that have been deeply informative to me. And it really brings up an interesting thing. It's kind of a classic. There are some teachers who say, if you want to dig for water, don't dig 100 wells, dig one well. Dig one well and go deep. There's wisdom to that. On the other hand, as some teachers say, it's really important that you explore everything out there and find what resonates for you. And then give yourself to it fully. And the Buddha spoke of this. Your dharma, your path is to find your path. And once you've found your path, then you give yourself to it fully. So, in the olden days, you would study with whoever who was right next door, whoever was in your village or your town. That was your teacher. And now, because of the internet, it's nuts. There are these practices which were reserved for renunciates, reserved for the most elite, dedicated practitioners that you can now download as a PDF. And it gets overwhelming. It can be really, really overwhelming. Which is why it's so, so helpful to really take your time to explore what really resonates for you, because your practice will evolve. That's the nature of practice. Ajahn tells this great story about one of his big shifts in awareness. He was studying in the Zen tradition, and he was given a koan. A koan is a question that you contemplate, and the question is not necessarily, no, it's not at all answerable through the linear mind. It's a question that's designed to help you shift your consciousness. You know, what was your face before your parents were born? You know, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You know, the number of koans. So he was given his koan and he was working it. And it's a very interesting practice of contemplation, because you bring yourself to the question, it takes you into an experience, you stay present to that. When the light came on for him, he met for an interview with his teacher. And he said, I'm not so sure it's the question that I should be exploring, but who it is that's asking the question. As he said, his teacher, a big smile came on her face. So I've been informed by a lot of traditions. I'm really grateful for that. I've learned so much. A lot of those traditions had to do with willful practice and doing, which was appropriate for that time in my life. It resonated for me. I was drawn to it. Another definition of your path, your dharma, is what you can't not do. And for me, it was like the opportunity to practice in an ashram and go deep and celibacy vow, poverty vow, go for it. I couldn't not do it. That just totally worked for me. my call to teach through the lens of Buddhist psychology. Can't not do it. I feel no desire or inclination to call myself a Buddhist, but I'm deeply informed by it. All the practices of doing have a natural counterbalance or an evolution around moving into being. One of the first things my guru said on one of the first retreats I did with him, he said, once you're on the train, you can put down your bags. That's so powerful. I oftentimes share that on a retreat. Like when you're on a retreat, I've often said, I'm going to do this retreat. I finally learned I'm going to let this retreat do me. It has to do with opening into presence, opening into awareness itself, resting in presence. So again, the question comes, how has your practice evolved over the years? As many years as you've been practicing, how has it changed? It's quite possible that as you were practicing, you heard something, a teaching or another technique that just had your name on it. For some, because we can feel a devotion to the technique we're doing, there can be a sense of, I can't let myself get distracted. And that could be true. But it could also be that there's something calling for deeper development. And you might just hear some teaching about developing concentration, and you might just feel like, I want to know more about that. I want to know more about what it means to go into deeper concentration. Or you might hear some teaching around developing the witness, really developing the strength of non-preferential viewpoint. Or you might hear something around surrender, the surrender practices, and just you can't not go there. So it becomes a really fine line, because on the one hand, one of my teachers said, the reason why most people stop practicing is precisely because it's working. A practice is designed to bring up whatever's undigested in your life. Just what happens. If you want to learn concentration, you start studying concentration techniques, and guess what? You're going to notice how your mind is simply a caffeinated brain. You might be drawn to develop compassion. So you do the compassion practices, and suddenly you're going to notice how focused you are in self-preservation you are, how judgmental you are. You might focus on the practices of letting go and realize what a control freak you are. That's all perfectly on schedule. That's what they're designed to do. So on the one hand, if you feel some discomfort and you're feeling like, oh, there's another practice out there for me to study, you might be a spiritual shopper. On the other hand, it could be that you're denying yourself something that is part of an organic development of your own practice. The only one who's going to know is you. And the only way you'll know is by practice and evaluation. All we can do, and again, this kind of comes back to these practices of liberation. As the Buddha allegedly said, you have to understand, no one is going to save you. When I heard that, I thought, whoa, I actually was hoping someone would. But the Buddha said you have to take responsibility for your own awakening. As I spent a lot of years kind of in a lineage tradition as part of a little puppy pile of doing what the guru told me, there was a lot of comfort in I'm just going to do what's in front of me and do as I'm told, and all will be well. I developed inside of that. And at some point it became confining. But I really do believe that we do need to take responsibility for our own awakening. And for each of us, our path is unique. I'll talk about that in a little bit more. It's part of the practice of self-study, of really studying the self. So one of the elements, one of the doorways within this wide lens, so you think, let's say you're drawn to through teaching, practicing through the lens of Buddhism. It's not a narrow path. It's a really, really wide path. Just as in human nature, there are those of us who are drawn through the doorway of concentration. Some of us are drawn through the doorway of witness. Some of us are drawn through the doorway of really deep investigation of the psyche. Some of us are drawn through surrender. Some of us are drawn through devotion. All of those doorways are available through this lens of practicing through Buddhism. And just as there's so many ways to practice yoga, there's so many ways to practice meditation. It's been said, I think the scripture says there are 180,000 Dharma gates, 180,000 doorways to presence and awakening. That's a lot. Finding them for yourself, that's the key. So all you can do, as the Buddha allegedly said, or my hallucination of what the Buddha said, is give yourself fully to a practice and then ruthlessly evaluate. Is the result of this feeling more wholesome or less wholesome? The only one who can determine your path is you. And it's only going to come through honest, sincere, ruthless evaluation. My first experience of deeper concentration came on a month-long retreat. The jhanas, as they're referred to, are what you could call kind of concentration states that move you progressively deeper into presence. And it's been kind of mapped out, the classic teaching is there's sort of nine levels that you go through. And chances are you've experienced these, some of the initial ones. And they all come out of presence. And the first is just this kind of upwelling of feeling like you've just arrived. It's this incredible flush of presence that's intensely joyful. And then part of the practice of jhana, this is a quick summary, is you're using the anchor, the classical anchor of breath or sound. And when you notice that state of absorption beginning to arise, you can move your attention from your anchor to investigate that's the state itself. When I first experienced this flush, this upwelling of intense joy, not coming from the outside, coming from the inside, I thought, it's happened. I'm arrived. I'm done. But when I began to kind of explore that state of upwelling joy, I realized it's not that stable. It's actually fluctuating a little bit here. So then the practice is you explore, well, what's more stable than that? There's something more stable than that. And that practice sort of takes you progressively deeper and deeper and deeper. So I had one particular moment that was an insight for me. As I was meditating, a really deep state of absorption, it's probably about the third week of a month-long retreat, my attention just went to my right hand. And as I just felt my right hand from the inside, I could feel it getting warm and tingling and feeling like the heat expanding. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Let me just sustain attention here. And it got really, really hot. I thought, well, that's cool. I wonder if I can do it with my left hand. So again, in the state of deep concentration, I focused on my left hand. I could feel my right hand cooling off and my left hand getting really, really warm. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can switch it back and forth. And so I kind of watched that switching back and forth. And it was kind of like moving deeper and deeper into concentration, but also having the sense of the observer, like really watching this and thinking, wow. I've always known through my yoga practice that prana follows chitta, like energy follows attention. But here it was. And I thought, wow, I wonder if I could heat one hand up and cool the other one off. And I could, and I switched it. And then I remembered the story I read about Swami Rama in Life magazine. That goes back. He was one of the first practitioners from the East who was studying, I think it was at the Mayo Clinic. And what they could not understand was how he could make one hand warm and the other cool and switch it back and forth. And I thought, I'm doing what Swami Rama did. And right on the heels of that was this very searing insight that said, this is fun, but it's not liberating. You know, I talked earlier of how we have this call to practice. And we also have this egoic drive to be somebody. And how practice can really help you be somebody. You got more energy flow going. You're less identified. You're more creative. You're more responsive. And then it moves you into being somebody special. That was a moment of being somebody special. And I'm so grateful for that insight that just cut it off. This is fun. This is special. But it's not liberating. And that helped me move to just a completely different level of practice. Part of my practice, very much kind of inspired by living with my wonderful wife, Tara, was studying with Tsoknyi Rinpoche in the Dzogchen tradition. And this again moves more toward the non-dual. Now, what's so interesting, and Tsoknyi Rinpoche, if you have a chance to study with him, he's delightful. He really gets the Western mind. His English just keeps getting better and better. He's funny. He's really funny. When he first started teaching Dzogchen, and Dzogchen, I'm going to share with you a sutra from Dzogchen, which I find really powerful. But the idea is it is about back to doing nothing. It's about just being awareness itself. My understanding is when he first started teaching, his English was poor, coming from the Dzogchen tradition, he would talk about concentration practice as, he would call it stupid meditation. Because they're just reinforcing a self that's doing something. But what's interesting is when you study with him, he may have changed. It's been a couple of years since I practiced with him. The first part of a retreat is you're doing what's called shamatha with support. You're calming the mind with support of the breath. So you're doing concentration to calm and arrive. The second half moves more toward open awareness. So again, there's this incredible dance, this incredible balance of using concentration, using the tool of calming as a way of exploring alternative states. So what is this practice of Dzogchen? There are books, there are encyclopedias written about it. But there's one particular sutra which is considered kind of the flower of Dzogchen practice, which can kind of give you a taste of this. So if you're up for it, I'd like to lead you into a little reflection. I'm going to offer the sutra, and then I'm going to have just a couple of little pointing out instructions, and then I'll reinforce the sutra, and then just see where it takes you. So if you might close your eyes, feel your breath, and let your breath be effortless and easy. The sutra has two parts. Utterly awake, sense doors wide open. Utterly open, non-fixating awareness. And to break this down a little bit, you might take a few moments and open your attention to sound. And allow the sounds to be there as they are. Open your awareness to feeling externally and internally. And imagine you could allow all the sensations to be there, to change as they need to, all by themselves. Open your awareness to smell, to taste. If your eyes are closed, open your attention to sight, the perception of light beyond your closed eyes. If your eyes are open, just notice all the sights, all the images, colors, shape. And you might consider the brain as a sense organ as well, acknowledging this process of interpretation, cognizing. Allow all the senses to be wide open, just as they are, allowing anything to shift or move or change. Now, if you would, imagine the space outside your body, extending out beyond the furthest stars. Explore what it's like now. Utterly awake, sense doors wide open. Utterly open, non-fixating awareness. You might now deepen the breath, sense what may have shifted, what may have changed. Quality of presence. When you're ready, you can deeply acknowledge what has shifted. Let your body move, let your eyes open, or remain with them closed. To be able to really experience that sutra, it's so subtle, so subtle. You cannot make it happen. But we can prepare the most optimal environment for it to happen. And that is where concentration, mindfulness, all the techniques come into play. I really believe the more I practice, for myself, and again, this is just me, and I'm filled with delusions and hallucinations, that the practices around self-awareness and self-diagnosis, I think it all comes down to what's presenting right now. And then deeply asking, how does this want me to be with it? I think that's the path. And in your own practice, you may sense that there are certain qualities that may be calling for development. I talked earlier of how there are times when we're drawn to developing compassion. And you might find in the balance of wisdom and compassion, sometimes you can have the wisdom part. You can see clearly into the nature of reality, but it can be kind of cold if there's no compassion. On the other hand, if you're all compassion with no wisdom, that can be really messy, because you can find yourself wanting to learn people's lessons for them rather than the wisdom to allow people to learn their own lessons. Each one of these paths it's so ripe for insight and possibility. I believe it all comes down ultimately to the pathless path. That all you have, what is happening right now? How does this want me to be with it right now? The key to all of this seems to be sincerity. And what arises is called sometimes in this tradition bodhicitta, the awakening of wisdom, your capacity to see what's true, not your embellishments, not your hopes, not your stories, but to see what's true. And the awakening of the heart, your capacity to hold, your capacity to be with anything and everything that arises. That's what's possible. Again, as the Buddha allegedly said, you have to understand no one is going to save you. And what does it mean for you to take responsibility for your own enlightenment? This is such an amazing ride. I've been so blessed along the way. And I'm reminded, my final offering here, James Barras, who's one of the founders of Spirit Rock Meditation Center, who's been practicing forever, leading long retreats forever. He shared once how at the end of a long retreat, a month-long retreat, he feels like I just barely have my fingernails in the iceberg of understanding. I thought, man, if he can admit that, I can admit that. Not only is that an admission, it's something to embrace. It's only when we have the innocence of learning that we can truly learn. It's only when we can really embrace the mystery of what it means to be alive in one of these portable flesh units that we have the possibility of shifting our attention into true and deep awakening. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. So many blessings in your practice. I look forward to sharing more with you down the road. Happy trails.